The wind came howling down from the high peaks of the Colorado Rockies like something alive and full of malice, carrying snowflakes that cut the skin like ground glass. It stripped the last warmth from the air and sent it spinning into the gray. Nothing above the tree line, leaving behind a cold so deep it felt personal. Like the land itself had decided that anyone foolish enough to be out in this weather deserved whatever came next. Jessamine Wickliffe stood on the mountain trail with her carpet bag pressed against her chest and watched the mail coach disappear around the bend below its lantern, swinging like a dying firefly until the snow swallowed it whole. The driver had apologized, if you could call it that. He had a wife and children in Elkhorn Creek, he said. He could not risk the team on 4 more miles of mountain road in a blizzard that was only getting worse. The Drummond Ranch was up ahead, he told her, pointing vaguely toward a wall of white nothing. Just follow the tree line and keep the creek on your left. You will find it. Then he was gone and Jessamine was alone. 23 years old, a carpet bag containing 2 dresses, a hairbrush, a Bible with her mother's handwriting in the margins, and a small wooden box that held $3 silver. Every cent she had left in the world. Not enough for passage back east, even if there had been anything to go back to. She started walking. The snow was already past her ankles and climbing. Her boots, good leather ones, but worn thin from 3 years of pacing schoolroom floors, offered almost no protection against the wet cold that crept upward through her stockings and settled into her bones like a tenant who intended to stay. Her woolen shawl, the nicest thing she owned, that was not packed in the carpet bag, was already soaked through and heavy on her shoulders. 4 miles, the driver had said. 4 miles through a blizzard up a mountain on a trail she had never walked before to meet a man she had never met, who had agreed to make her his wife based on a 2-paragraph letter and a newspaper advertisement that read like a livestock requisition. Wanted, wife for widower with 2 sons. Must be educated and willing to work. Practical arrangement. No promises of love. Jessamine had answered that advertisement 3 weeks ago from a boarding house in Pennsylvania where she could no longer afford the rent. She had written the letter with hands that shook not from cold, but from the particular tremor that comes when a person is doing the last thing they can think of before giving up entirely. She had been Miss Wycliffe, the school teacher, for 3 years, respected if underpaid, living in a rented room above a dry goods store and teaching 14 children their letters in a 1-room schoolhouse that smelled of chalk dust and wood smoke. It was not a grand life, but it was hers, and she had built it from nothing after everything else fell away. Her father died first. Pneumonia took him in the winter of 1871 swiftly and without mercy, the way winter took everything on the Ohio plains. Her mother followed 6 months later, not from any disease the doctor could name, but from a simple unwillingness to keep living in a world that no longer contained the man she loved. The farm went to the bank for debts Jessamine did not even know existed until the lawyers came with their papers and their sympathetic frowns. And then there was Edmund Pratt, the son of a cloth merchant in town, handsome, in a well-fed sort of way with soft hands and softer promises. He had courted Jessamine when her family still owned land, when she was still a farmer's daughter with prospects. 3 years of Sunday dinners and carefully chaperoned walks, 3 years of hints about a future together, a ring that was always just around the corner. When the farm was sold and Jessamine was left with nothing but her education and her pride, Edmund had written her a letter so cold it might have been drafted by his accountant. A man in my position requires a wife of appropriate standing. He wished her well. He was sure she would find her way. She had found her way to a schoolhouse in Pennsylvania, and when the territory cut the education budget and the school closed its doors, she had found her way to a newspaper advertisement placed by a stranger in the Colorado mountains. The trail curved upward through a stand of lodgepole pines, so thick the snow could barely penetrate their canopy, and for a blessed moment the wind dropped to something merely painful rather than savage. Jessamine paused to catch her breath and adjust the carpet bag, which had grown heavier with every step, as if it were absorbing the weight of her situation. Her fingers were white inside her patched gloves. She could no longer feel her toes. 2 miles, she estimated. Maybe less. or maybe more. In the snow, every distance became a guess, and every guess became a prayer. She thought about the letter Obadiah Drummond had sent in reply to hers. It had arrived 8 days after she mailed her own, which meant he had responded almost immediately, which meant he was either desperate or decisive or both. The handwriting was straight and economical, the letters formed with the efficiency of a man who did not waste ink any more than he wasted words. Miss Wycliffe, your letter received, the position remains open. You should know the winters here are hard and the work is constant. If you can accept a marriage of practical purpose with no expectation of romantic feeling, you are welcome to come before the first heavy snow. Travel arrangements enclosed. O. Drummond. No pleasantries, no questions about her appearance or her temperament or her views on anything at all. Just the facts laid out like fence posts in a straight line. Jessamine had found the directness oddly comforting. At least this man would not dress up reality in Sunday clothes the way Edmund had. The trees thinned, and the wind hit her again like a fist. She staggered, caught herself on a trunk, and looked up through the swirling white. For a terrible moment, she saw nothing but snow and darkness, and the thought came to her with the calm certainty of a mathematical proof that she was going to die on this mountain. She was going to freeze to death 4 miles from a house she had never seen, carrying a letter from a man she had never met. And come spring, someone would find her body leaning against this tree, with her carpet bag still clutched to her chest, like something precious. Then she saw the light. It was faint yellow, flickering through the snow like a candle in a cathedral, but it was there. Warm and real and impossible to mistake for anything but what it was. A window, a house, a life burning against the darkness. Jessamine's knees gave way not from weakness, but from relief so intense it overwhelmed her body's ability to remain upright. She went down on one knee in the snow, carpet bag tumbling from her arms, and stayed there for 3 breaths, 4 or 5, until she could trust her legs again. Then she stood, retrieved her bag, and walked toward the light. The house emerged from the storm like something dreamed. 2 stories of massive timber built to withstand whatever the mountains could throw at it. A covered porch wrapped around the front, and smoke rose from a stone chimney in a column so straight it seemed to defy the wind. Behind it, barely visible through the snow, she could make out the dark shapes of a barn and outbuildings. This was not a homesteader's cabin. This was a compound built by men who intended to stay. She was still standing at the gate, snow gathering on her shoulders and her hair, when the front door opened. One man she had expected. She had prepared herself for. One man had rehearsed in her mind what she would say. To one man had steeled herself for the awkwardness of presenting herself to one man as a potential wife, a stranger offering herself up to be evaluated like merchandise at a general store. What she had not prepared for was 3. They filled the doorway like 3 trees grown from the same root, identical in height, which was considerable, well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to block the warm light spilling from the house behind them. 3 faced with the same strong jaw, the same high cheekbones, the same amber eyes that caught the lamplight and reflected it back like wolves in a fire circle. Chestnut brown hair on all 3, though each wore it slightly different. One pushed back, one falling forward, one tucked under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen years of weather. Triplets. 3 identical mountain men standing in the doorway of the house where she was supposed to become one man's wife. Jessamine's carpet bag fell from her hands into the snow. For the second time that night. The one in the center spoke first. His voice was low and carried the particular weight of a man accustomed to having his words taken seriously without needing to raise his volume. You, the teacher from Ohio. It was not a question so much as a confirmation. He already knew who she was. This was Obadiah Drummond, the one who had written the letter. She could tell by the way he stood slightly forward of the other 2, bearing the posture of a man who had appointed himself responsible for whatever happened next. I am, Jessamine said, and was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Jessamine Wycliffe. The one on the left said nothing. He studied her from the crown of her snow-covered head to her ruined boots with an expression she could only describe as clinical disappointment. the way a horse trader might look at an animal that had been advertised as healthy but arrived with a limp. The one on the right grinned. Lord, you walked in this. Come inside before I have to dig you out of a snowdrift in the morning. Jessamine stepped through the doorway, and the warmth of the house hit her like a wall. For a moment, she could not breathe, so sharp was the contrast between the killing cold outside and the heat rolling from the massive stone fireplace that dominated the front room. She blinked her eyes, adjusting to the lamplight, and took in her surroundings. The house was large and solidly built with high ceilings and floors of polished pine that gleamed in the firelight. A staircase curved upward along the far wall. The furniture was heavy and well-made, crafted by hands that knew wood. Everything was clean, rigorously clean in the way of a place that was maintained out of discipline rather than domesticity. But it was what she did not see that struck her hardest. No curtains on the windows, no flowers in vases, no embroidered cushions or decorative touches of any kind. No sign that a woman had ever lived here at all, despite the fact that one had and had died here and had left behind two motherless boys. The house felt like a barracks, efficient, functional, and utterly devoid of softness. You did not mention, Jessamine said carefully, turning back to face the three men who now stood in a loose semicircle between her and the door, that there were three of you. Obadiah Drummond did not flinch. Three brothers. Built this place together, own it together. Figured it was understood. You figured that a young woman traveling alone to meet a stranger would understand that she would be living under the same roof as three men, none of whom she has ever met. The silence that followed had weight to it. The one on the right, the one who had smiled, cleared his throat. The one on the left, the one who had said nothing, turned and walked out the back door into the storm without a word, as if the conversation had confirmed something he already suspected, and he wanted no further part of it. You have every right to leave, Obadiah said. His eyes were level, his voice flat, offering the option as fact rather than suggestion. But that storm will not break before dawn, and 4 miles of mountain trail in the dark will kill you quicker than anything you will find in this house. That is not a threat. That is geography. He was right. Of course he was right. The wind shrieked against the windows as if to underscore the point, and Jessamine could feel the cold still radiating from her own skin from her soaked shawl, and her frozen boots reminding her how close she had come to not arriving at all. My brothers, Obadiah said, as if making introductions at a church social, rather than in the front room of a remote mountain ranch while a blizzard tried to tear the roof off. Phineas, the one who left, he is the quiet one, does not say much, but does not miss anything either. And this is Lachlan, the loud one. Lachlan Drummond offered his hand, and when Jessamine took it, his grip was warm and firm and accompanied by a smile that seemed entirely genuine. Lack, please. Only my mother called me Lachlan, and only when I was in trouble, which was always. Before Jessamine could respond, the sound of small feet on the stairs drew every eye in the room. Two boys appeared on the landing, both in nightshirts, both with the same chestnut hair as their father and uncles. The older one, 8 years old, stood at the top of the stairs with his arms crossed over his chest, regarding Jessamine with an expression of such careful suspicion that she felt she was being evaluated by a judge rather than a child. He had his father's jaw and his father's eyes, and something in his posture, a rigidity that spoke of responsibility shouldered too young, made Jessamine's heart clench. The younger boy of 5 came down the stairs at full speed, bare feet slapping on the polished wood, and stopped directly in front of Jessamine with the fearless curiosity that only very young children possess. His hair stood up in every direction, and there was something that looked like blackberry preserves smeared across his left cheek. "Pa, there is a lady," he announced, as if this fact might have escaped everyone's attention. Then he looked up at Jessamine with eyes so round and earnest that she felt something crack open in her chest. "Can you tie shoes? Uncle Lack ties them loose, and I almost fell 3 times already today." Jessamine crouched down until her eyes were level with his. "I can." My mother taught me to tie knots when I was even smaller than you. She took his foot gently and retied the lace in a double knot firm and secure. The boy looked down at his shoe with an expression of pure wonder, as though she had performed a miracle rather than a mundane task. "This is Thatcher," Obadiah said, "and up there is Bellamy." Bellamy did not come down the stairs. He did not smile or wave or offer any greeting at all. He simply stood there, arms crossed, watching Jessamine with eyes that contained something far more complicated than a child's simple wariness of strangers. She recognized that look because she had worn it herself in the months after her parents died. It was the look of someone who had learned through terrible experience that people you love can disappear without warning, and who had decided consciously or not that the safest course of action was to never love anyone new. "Boys," Obadiah said, "back to bed. Miss Wycliffe and I need to talk." Thatcher protested loudly and was carried upstairs by Lachlan, who produced sound effects and commentary that transformed the journey into an adventure rather than a banishment. Bellamy turned and walked to his room without being told, twice his small shoulders squared like a soldier dismissed from duty. In the kitchen, Obadiah poured coffee. The liquid was black as road tar and strong enough to make Jessamine's eyes water when the steam hit her face. She wrapped her frozen fingers around the tin cup and felt the warmth seep into her bones like a reprieve. "I will say this plainly." Obadiah began sitting across from her at the heavy kitchen table with his hands wrapped around his own cup. "Because I do not know how to say it any other way and would not trust myself if I did. I need a wife, not for romance or companionship or any of the things that word is supposed to mean. I had those things once. They are gone." He paused, and Jessamine saw something move behind those amber eyes, something that surfaced for just a moment before being pushed back down with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 2 years learning to contain his grief in an airtight box. "I need someone to manage this household. Cook, clean, mend, keep things running when my brothers and I are out working cattle or cutting timber. And I need someone to teach my boys. They are growing up wild, and that was fine when they were small, but Bellamy needs proper schooling, and Thatcher needs a gentle hand and patience that I do not possess and have never pretended to." "What do I receive in return?" Jessamine asked, though she already knew. She needed to hear him say it. "A roof, food. The Drummond name if that carries weight for you, and in this valley it does. Protection from weather, and from anyone who might think a woman alone is an easy target. A room of your own, privacy, and my word, which I have never broken in 33 years of living, that no one in this house will lay a hand on you without your wanting it." "Why me?" Obadiah looked at her the way she imagined he looked at a stretch of fence that needed mending, assessing the situation with a practicality that left no room for sentiment. "You are educated. The boys need that. You are alone, which means you will take this seriously because you have no other options pulling you away. And you walked 4 miles through a blizzard to get here carrying everything you own in a bag the size of a bread loaf." He set down his cup. "You are desperate enough to say yes." The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Jessamine felt heat rush to her face despite the chill still clinging to her skin. She wanted to stand up and tell this blunt, presumptuous man that she was not desperate, that she had options, that she was choosing this path rather than being forced down it by circumstance. But that would have been a lie, and Obadiah Drummond did not seem like a man who had patience for lies. So instead, she sat with the truth of his words and felt them settle into the same place where her mother's death and her father's debts and Edmund Pratt's cold letter already lived. The place where reality was stored, undecorated and unforgiving. "She will not last." The voice came from behind her, and Jessamine turned to see Phineas Drummond standing in the kitchen doorway, snow melting on his shoulders, his face set in an expression of such a flat certainty that it might have been carved from the same granite as the mountains outside. Thin as a birch twig in drought, Phineas continued, not bothering to lower his voice despite the fact that the woman he was discussing sat 3 feet away. First real winter will snap her. And when she runs because she will run, those boys will lose someone else. You want Bellamy to go through that again, OB, because I do not. The kitchen went very quiet. Jessamine could hear the fire cracking in the stove, the wind battering the windows, and the distant sound of Thatcher's voice upstairs asking Lachlan for one more story. Lachlan appeared in the doorway behind his brother. You do not know the first thing about her, Finn. She walked 4 miles in a killing blizzard. Half the ranch hands in this valley would not have tried one. Phineas did not acknowledge his brother's words. He kept his eyes on Jessamine, and she met them without looking away. They were the same amber as Obadiah's and Lachlan's, but colder like whiskey left out in the frost. The eyes of a man who watched everything and trusted nothing. I do not need you to believe in me, Jessamine said, and her voice shook slightly, but she did not drop her gaze. I only need you to give me the chance to prove myself. Phineas said nothing. He turned and walked upstairs, his heavy boots marking each step on the wooden floor, like a verdict being postponed rather than delivered. After he was gone, Obadiah refilled his coffee as though his brother's objection was a weather report he had already factored into his plans. Finn lost someone too, he said quietly. We all did. He just carries it different. That night, Jessamine lay in a narrow bed in a small room off the kitchen. The housekeeper's quarters, clearly not the wife's room. She was still shivering despite the 2 quilts piled on the bed, her body still releasing the cold it had absorbed during the walk. Through the thin wall, she could hear 3 male voices in low conversation, the words indistinct, but the tones clear enough to read. Phineas clipped and certain. A mistake. Lachlan warmer pushing back. At least let her tree. And Obadiah, the lowest voice, the one that ended the discussion with a sentence that came through the wall just clearly enough for Jessamine to make out every word. I have decided that is the end of it. Jessamine pulled the quilts to her chin and held her carpetbag against her chest, the leather cold and familiar against her fingers. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, 3 strangers were arguing about her future in the room next door. She was not sure if she had found shelter or walked into a trap, but she was alive, and she was warm, and tomorrow she would find out which. 5 days passed before the snow stopped falling, and the trail to Elkhorn Creek became passable enough for a man on horseback. Obadiah sent word to Reverend Albright that same morning, and by afternoon, the preacher arrived on a gray mare that looked as unhappy about the journey as its rider. Reverend Albright was 62 years old, thin as a fence rail, with eyes like a hawk and opinions he did not keep to himself. He sat in the front parlor with his Bible on his knee and looked from Obadiah to Jessamine and back again, with the expression of a man being asked to bless a transaction he found morally suspicious. A young woman, the Reverend said, his voice carrying the particular weight of someone who believed God had personally authorized his disapproval. Living under the same roof as 3 unmarried men, on a remote mountain ranch, miles from the nearest neighbor. You understand, Miss Wycliffe, that reputation once lost cannot be recovered. She will be my wife, Obadiah said, and his tone carried no room for negotiation, no space for the Reverend to wedge in further objections. My brothers are her family. That is the end of it. The ceremony took place in the front parlor, witnessed by Mrs. Brennan, a weather-beaten woman of 55 from the nearest ranch who had ridden 3 hours through snow drifts to be there and declared the whole arrangement perfectly sensible. Jessamine wore her navy wool dress, the finest thing she owned, with a lace collar she had sewn herself from a scrap of old petticoat. It was not a wedding gown, but it was clean and pressed, and it would have to be enough. The vows were brief and stripped of sentiment. Jessamine repeated the words as Reverend Albright read them, her voice steady, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. She was promising to honor and cherish a man she had known for 5 days, in a house she had entered as a stranger, surrounded by people who were still deciding whether she belonged. When the Reverend indicated that the groom should kiss his bride, the room went still. Obadiah looked at Jessamine, and she saw the question in his eyes, a question that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with consent. She nodded just barely, and he leaned down. He was nearly a full head taller and pressed his lips to hers. It was brief. It was formal. It was the first kiss of Jessamine's life. Her heart did not flutter with romantic feeling. It lurched with the raw awareness that her entire existence had just been rewritten in the space of 2 seconds. She was no longer Jessamine Wycliffe, the schoolteacher, with no prospects. She was Jessamine Drummond, wife and mother mistress of a mountain ranch bound by law to a man who had chosen her the way he might choose a new piece of equipment for function, not feeling. "Well," Mrs. Brennan said into the silence, clapping her hands together once. "Clean and efficient. My kind of wedding." Phineas stood in the corner of the room, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Lachlan smiled, but his eyes were bright and wet, and Jessamine could not tell whether the moisture came from happiness or from memory, from joy at what was beginning, or grief for what had ended in the same room 2 years before. That evening, Obadiah led her upstairs. The room at the end of the second-floor hallway was clearly a woman's space, feminine in its furnishings in a way that nothing else in the house was. A delicate writing desk sat beneath the window. The bed was covered with a quilt worked in shades of blue and yellow, the stitches precise and even. A hairbrush rested on the dressing table, and when Jessamine looked closely, she could see strands of auburn hair still caught in its bristles. On the windowsill, a book lay open, its page marked with a pressed flower that had lost its color long ago. Whoever had been reading this book had stopped in the middle of a chapter and never come back to finish it. The wardrobe, when she opened it, was full. Silk dresses, wool coats, a riding habit in dark green, fine things, expensive things, the wardrobe of a woman who had been loved and provided for. Jessamine's 2 cotton dresses looked like rags hanging beside them. "The room needs someone in it," Obadiah said from the doorway, his voice controlled in a way that told Jessamine the control was costing him something. "Rosemary has been gone 2 years. It is time." He left without another word, and Jessamine stood alone in the room of the dead woman whose place she had taken. She touched the writing desk where Rosemary Drummond had perhaps written letters or kept household accounts. She looked at the hairbrush with its strands of auburn hair. She picked up the book on the windowsill and read the sentence where Rosemary had stopped reading the last words her eyes had touched before everything changed. The flower pressed between the pages crumbled at Jessamine's touch, falling to dust on the polished wood, and she felt something tighten in her throat that was not quite grief and not quite guilt, but something in between. She was living in a dead woman's room, sleeping in a dead woman's bed, wearing a dead woman's name. And outside the window, the mountains rose up in the darkness, like a reminder that this place was older and harder and more permanent than any human arrangement, and that survival here was not a right, but a daily negotiation with forces that did not care whether you lived or died. That night, Jessamine lay under Rosemary's quilt and listened to the wind and tried not to think about what the morning would require of her, and failed. Morning came at 5 o'clock, announced not by light but by habit. Jessamine had been rising before dawn for 3 years as a schoolteacher, and her body did not distinguish between a schoolroom in Pennsylvania and a kitchen in the Colorado mountains. She dressed quickly in the dark, pinned her hair, and made her way downstairs with the careful steps of someone learning the geography of a new house. The kitchen was not empty. Phineas Drummond sat at the table in near darkness, a tin cup of coffee steaming before him, his coat still on, as though he had just come in from outside or was about to go back out. He looked up when Jessamine entered, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the wind against the windows and the soft ticking of the clock on the shelf above the stove. He studied her with those cold amber eyes, and she stood in the doorway and let him look, refusing to fidget or drop her gaze or do any of the things that the nervous, uncertain part of her desperately wanted to do. Then Phineas spoke. He did not look at her when he said it, turning his gaze instead toward the window, where the first gray hint of dawn was beginning to outline the mountain ridges. "Ob drinks it black, strong, lack like sugar. I take it black, no sugar." He stood, put on his hat, and walked out the back door into the cold without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft thud that somehow carried more weight than a slam. Jessamine stood in the kitchen, coffee pot in hand, and understood that Phineas Drummond had just told her how to make coffee for his family. It was not acceptance. It was not welcome. It was something far more cautious than either of those things. It was a man who had positioned himself at the edge of trust, looking in, and decided to wait one more day before walking away. She measured the coffee carefully. Black and strong for Obadiah. Sugar for Lachlan. Black, no sugar for the man who had given her exactly one chance to prove she belonged in his family's house. The first morning of her marriage to a stranger. The first pot of coffee in a life she had not chosen but had chosen to accept. Outside, the sun was rising over the Rocky Mountains, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold that took her breath away. Despite everything and the house around her, this fortress of timber and stone that three brothers had built with their own hands began to creak and settle and warm as the day came on, as if it too were waking up, deciding what to make of the woman who now lived inside it. The first week of Jessamine Drummond's marriage passed in a series of small disasters and quiet revelations, each one teaching her something new about the life she had chosen, or more accurately, the life that had chosen her when every other option had been stripped away. She burned 3 batches of bread before she understood the temperament of the massive cast iron stove that dominated the kitchen like a bad-tempered monarch. The damper was finicky, requiring a precise combination of adjustment and patience that no one had thought to explain to her, and each failed attempt filled the kitchen with smoke that brought Thatcher running to see what was happening and sent Bellamy retreating upstairs with a look of resigned disappointment that cut deeper than any criticism. It was Lachlan who finally showed her the trick of it. He appeared in the kitchen on the third morning of scorched bread, leaned against the counter with his arms crossed and that easy grin on his face and said, "You are fighting her. Stop fighting and start listening. She tells you what she wants if you pay attention." He demonstrated adjusting the damper with a practiced touch that spoke of years of familiarity, explaining the relationship between airflow and heat in terms so simple that Jessamine felt foolish for not seeing it herself. When the fourth batch of bread came out golden and fragrant, Lachlan whooped loud enough to startle the horses in the barn, and even Thatcher, who had been watching from his perch on a kitchen stool, clapped his small hands together and announced that this was the best bread in the whole entire world. Water had to be hauled from the creek a 100-yard walk each way that turned Jessamine's arms to burning rope by the end of the first day. The path was icy and treacherous, and twice she slipped and sent the bucket tumbling, soaking her dress and her boots and her already fragile confidence. Laundry was done in water so cold it turned her fingers white, then red, then cracked and bleeding at the knuckles. She did not know how to saddle a horse, and her first attempt to milk the family's single dairy cow ended with the cow kicking the pail across the barn and Jessamine sitting in the hay with milk soaking through her skirt and her pride in worse condition than her clothing. She did not complain. Not once. She rose at 5, made coffee the way each brother liked it, prepared breakfast before the men left for the day's work, taught the boys their lessons through the morning, managed the household through the afternoon, cooked supper, read to the children before bed, and collapsed into her mattress each night, so thoroughly exhausted. That sleep came like a mercy swallowing her before loneliness or doubt could take hold. Each of the 3 Drummond brothers existed in a different orbit around her, and the distance of each orbit told her something about the man. Obadiah treated her like a business partner. He communicated in clear directives, setting expectations the way he might assign tasks to a ranch hand, specific and measurable, and devoid of anything that might be mistaken for personal interest. Breakfast at 5:30. The boys eat at 7. Thatcher likes his eggs soft. Bellamy likes them firm. Do not let them fill up on sweet things before a meal. The household accounts are in the ledger on my desk, and you are welcome to review them. In the evenings, he retreated to his study, a small room off the front hall, where a lamp burned late into the night. Jessamine brought him coffee sometimes and found him sitting behind his desk, account books open before him, but his eyes fixed on something invisible in the middle distance. Once she entered without knocking and caught him holding a small square of cloth, a handkerchief embroidered with a single letter R in thread that might once have been red but had faded to the color of old roses. He tucked it into his pocket with a movement so swift and practiced that she understood he did this often, this private communion with a piece of fabric that still carried perhaps the faintest trace of a scent he could not let go. Phineas remained a riddle wrapped in silence. He left the house before dawn and returned after dark, spending his days in the forests and high pastures that surrounded the ranch, hunting and checking trap lines and doing whatever it was that men did when they needed to be alone with the mountains. He spoke to Jessamine only when absolutely necessary, and his words, when they came, were stripped down to their essential components like tools designed for a single purpose. But she began to notice things. The wood box beside the kitchen stove was always full replenished by hands she never saw at work. Every 3 days, a rabbit appeared on the kitchen table, cleaned and skinned and ready for cooking, the meat cut with a precision that spoke of long practice. When a particularly brutal cold snap drove the temperature well below zero, she woke one morning to find that someone had sealed her bedroom window from the outside with an extra layer of oiled paper blocking the drafts that had been stealing her sleep. Phineas was the only person in the house who rose earlier than she did. He never acknowledged these acts, and she never asked. To name what he was doing would be to force him to stop doing it, and Jessamine was learning that Phineas Drummond's language was not spoken, but enacted, written in firewood and rabbit meat and oiled paper in the quiet labor of a man who did not know how to say, "I accept you," but knew exactly how to show it. Lachlan was the bridge, the easiest to talk to, the quickest to laugh, the one who made the house feel less like a fortress and more like a home. He taught her to build a fire that would last through the night without tending to read the sky for weather changes to calm a horse spooked by thunder. He told stories at the supper table that made Thatcher howl with laughter and even drew the occasional twitch of amusement from Bellamy's carefully guarded mouth. He was warmth and noise and motion, the antidote to the heavy silence that his brothers carried. But Jessamine was not fooled. There were nights when Lachlan sat alone on the porch in the freezing dark, staring at nothing, and his face without the smile was the face of a man carrying something so heavy he could not put it down even long enough to sleep. The laughter she began to understand was not joy, but architecture. It was the structure he had built around his pain to keep it from collapsing outward and burying everyone around him. He was not happy. He was performing happiness with such skill and consistency that even his brothers had stopped looking beneath the surface. 2 weeks after the wedding, Jessamine discovered what all three brothers were hiding. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The boys were supposed to be doing their reading exercises in the front room, while Jessamine prepared supper. Thatcher was where she had left him, laboriously sounding out words with more enthusiasm than accuracy. But Bellamy was gone. She found him at the end of the second-floor hallway in the room Obadiah had told her was off-limits. The door was ajar, and through the gap she could see the boy sitting cross-legged on a dusty floor, holding a small wooden horse worn smooth by years of small hands, staring at a portrait that had been turned to face the wall. Jessamine hesitated. This was private ground marked by invisible boundaries that even she, a newcomer still learning the geography of this family, could feel. But the sound the boy was making, not quite crying, but something worse, a dry, hitching breath that meant he had been crying for so long that the tears had run out. That sound made her push the door open and step inside. The room was a nursery, or had been. A cradle draped in white cloth stood in one corner, and small furniture, a child's chair, a toy chest, a rocking horse, sat beneath sheets that had turned gray with dust. In the far corner, something caught Jessamine's eye and held it. An unfinished cradle, the wood still rough and unpolished, the joints fitted but not sanded, abandoned in the middle of construction by hands that would never complete the work. She was building this for the baby, Bellamy said without turning around. His voice was flat, emptied of everything except fact. Mama said every child needs something made by their mother's own hands. She made this horse for me. He held up the wooden toy. The cradle was for my sister. Jessamine sat down on the dusty floor beside him, close enough to be present, but not so close as to crowd. Your sister. Twins, Bellamy said. Thatch and a girl. The girl did not make it. Mama did not make it either. The weight of that statement, delivered in the matter-of-fact tone of a child who had rehearsed these words so many times they had lost their capacity to surprise him, settled over Jessamine like something physical. She had known the broad facts. Obadiah's letter had mentioned his wife's death in childbirth, the single sentence devoted to it carrying all the emotional weight of a weather report. But the twin, the lost daughter, the double grief that she had not known. Pa cried, Bellamy whispered, and the way he said it made clear that this was the most dangerous secret he possessed, the one thing he had never been supposed to see. I snuck downstairs. Pa was holding Mama and crying like the whole world was falling apart. Uncle Finn had to pull him away. Uncle Lack rode out for the doctor, but he came back too late. I was not supposed to see, but I did. And since then you have not cried, Jessamine said softly. Not a question, an understanding. Bellamy shook his head. Someone had to be strong. Pa could not. Uncle Finn went into the woods for 3 months. Uncle Lack started laughing all the time, but not real laughing. Someone had to watch Thatch. An 8-year-old boy who had appointed himself the man of the house because every actual man in it had been too broken to function, who had stopped being a child on the night his mother died, and had been carrying a man's weight on shoulders that still had years of growing to do. Would you tell me about her, Jessamine asked. Your mother. I would like to know about her. Bellamy turned to look at her, and the surprise in his face was so raw it hurt to witness. No one in this family talked about Rosemary Drummond. The silence around her name was not merely habitual, but architectural, a load-bearing wall that everyone was afraid to touch for fear the whole structure would come down. You want to hear really, she is part of this family. I do not want to erase that. I want to understand. Bellamy reached up and turned the portrait around. Rosemary Drummond looked out at them from the canvas with warm eyes and auburn hair, a baby in her arms, a boy standing proudly at her side, all of them captured in a moment before the world tore itself apart. She was not a great beauty in the way of magazine illustrations, but there was a kindness in her face that transcended prettiness, a warmth that even paint and canvas could not fully contain. She smelled like bread and lavender, Bellamy said. She always had time to listen. She could make anything out of wood and cloth, and she sang Irish songs that her grandmother taught her. Thatch does not remember much. He was too little. But I tell him stories sometimes so he will not forget. That is a brave thing to do. Do you promise you will not leave? Bellamy asked. In the sudden directness of the question, the raw need in his voice stripped away every layer of the serious, guarded boy and revealed the frightened child underneath. Even when things get hard, because things get hard here. Pa says winters are terrible hard. Jessamine looked into those amber eyes, Obadiah's eyes, Rosemary's son's eyes, and felt the weight of what she was about to promise. This was not a contractual obligation or a practical arrangement. This was a child asking her to be permanent, to be able to be the thing he was most afraid to hope for. I promise, she said. That evening after the boys were asleep, Jessamine found Obadiah in his study and told him everything. About the nursery, the unfinished cradle, the twin daughter no one had mentioned the night Bellamy had watched his father weep over his mother's body. Obadiah's reaction was immediate and controlled in a way that told her the control was barely holding. He should not have been in that room. I told the boys to stay out. They need permission to remember her Obiti, Jessamine said, using the shortened name Lachlan used, feeling its intimacy and its risk. Silence is not healing, it is just freezing the wound. Something cracked behind Obadiah's eyes. I should have taken her to Denver. They have real doctors there, surgeons, equipment, but Rosemary wanted to birth at home. She said children should be born on the land where they would grow up. I listened because I loved her and because I was too stupid to know that love is not the same thing as wisdom. You respected your wife's wishes. Respecting her wishes cost her life. Obadiah looked down at his hands, massive and calloused, the hands of a man who had built a house and tamed horses and fought off wolves. These hands can do almost anything, Jessamine: build, break, mend. But they could not keep her alive. They could not do the one thing that mattered. It was the first time he had opened himself to her, the first crack in the granite exterior he presented to the world. Jessamine wanted to reach across the desk and touch his hand, but knew instinctively that he could not bear tenderness right now, that it would break whatever was holding him together. Rosemary would want you to live, she said instead. She would want the boys to be happy. Obadiah did not reply. He stood and walked out into the cold night, and before the door closed, Jessamine heard him say so quietly, she almost missed it, "Thank you for talking to Bellamy." The next morning, Lachlan found Jessamine on the porch, hanging laundry in the thin winter sunlight. He helped her pin a shirt to the line, his movements easy and familiar, and then he spoke without looking at her, his voice stripped of its usual lightness. "The night Rosemary died, I was up on the mountain, cutting timber for winter. I was not here. By the time I rode back, it was over. Ob blames himself for not taking her to Denver. But me, I was not even here to blame myself for anything. I was just absent, and that is the worst kind of guilt there is. Not the guilt of doing something wrong, but the guilt of not being there at all." Jessamine looked at Lachlan, the brother who always smiled, the one who filled rooms with warmth and noise and the illusion of lightness, and she saw for the first time the shadow that lived behind the brightness. He was not cheerful because he was happy. He was cheerful because he was terrified that if he stopped performing happiness, he would fall apart, and there would be no one left to hold the family together. 3 weeks after the wedding, the Drummond family went to church. The ride to Elkhorn Creek took half a day in a wagon fitted with runners for the snow. Thatcher sat beside Jessamine in the back, holding her hand and chattering about everything he intended to show her in town. Bellamy sat up front with his father, silent and watchful. Phineas rode his own horse, keeping 10 paces behind the wagon like a rear guard who expected trouble. Elkhorn Creek was a small settlement, the kind that existed because geography demanded it, a natural stopping point between the mining camps to the north and the cattle ranges to the south. A post office, a general store, a saloon, and a white clapboard church with a bell tower that could be heard for miles across the valley floor. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone had already heard that the three Drummond brothers had brought home a mail-order bride. Every conversation in the churchyard died when the Drummond wagon appeared. Jessamine felt the weight of collective scrutiny settle on her like a physical thing as Obadiah helped her down from the wagon. She could hear the whispers before her feet touched the frozen ground, sharp, sibilant sounds that carried on the winter air. Mrs. Hargrove intercepted them at the church door with the precision of a military strategist. She was 45, handsome in a well-preserved way, married to the associate pastor, and possessed of a moral authority that she had awarded to herself and that no one in the community had ever successfully challenged. "Mrs. Drummond," she said, and the way she pronounced the name made it sound like an accusation rather than a greeting. "How brave of you to show your face in public. A young woman living up on that mountain with 3 men. I confess the mind does wonder what sort of domestic arrangement requires such an unusual household composition." The innuendo landed like a slap. Several women nearby exchanged glances that ranged from scandalized delight to barely concealed hostility. Jessamine felt her face burn and opened her mouth to respond, but before she could form words, Thatcher stepped forward. "Mama Jess makes us breakfast every morning," the boy announced with the unassailable confidence of a 5-year-old who has not yet learned that truth is sometimes insufficient defense against cruelty. "And she teaches me to write my name, and I can tie sailor knots now, real ones that do not come undone." Bellamy moved up beside his brother, his jaw set in a line so similar to his father's that the resemblance was startling. "She teaches us reading and arithmetic and history, and she makes Pa smile. Real smiles, not just polite ones. He has not smiled in 2 years." But it was the third voice that changed everything. Phineas Drummond stepped out from behind the wagon and walked to where Jessamine stood, positioning himself at her back. He did not touch her. He did not need to. His physical presence, the sheer immovable fact of him 6 feet 5 inches of mountain-bred silence and controlled power, was a statement that required no elaboration. Jessamine Drummond is my brother's wife, he said, and his voice carried across the churchyard with the low, penetrating authority of distant thunder. She is mother to my nephews. She is my family. That is all anyone needs to know about the arrangement, Mrs. Hargrove. The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Hargrove's face went from pink to white in the space of a heartbeat. No one in the valley wanted trouble with one Drummond brother, let alone all three. Jessamine stood very still, aware that something fundamental had just shifted beneath her feet. Phineas had not said I accept her in the privacy of their kitchen over coffee. He had said she is my family in front of every person in the community whose opinion might have mattered to him, burning his bridges publicly and permanently. For Phineas Drummond, a man who measured his words the way a miser measured gold, that declaration was the equivalent of an oath sworn in blood. The ride home was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the silence that had preceded it. This was the silence of people who had been through something together and come out on the same side. As the wagon climbed the mountain trail toward home, Obadiah spoke without looking at Jessamine, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I am sorry about that. Some people have too much time and not enough sense. It is all right, Jessamine replied, though her hands were still trembling. I expected talk. Expecting it does not make it acceptable. That night, washing dishes side by side in the kitchen, Jessamine said, "Thank you for what your family did today." Obadiah set down the dish towel. You are my wife, those are my children. What touches you touches all of us. It was a practical statement, but Jessamine heard something warmer living underneath it, something that had not been there a week ago. The winter deepened, and with it came something no one had anticipated. It began with the Morrison family 3 miles south down the valley. The oldest boy, 11, developed a high fever on a Monday. By Wednesday, his throat was swollen nearly shut, and a red rash had spread across his torso and arms. By Friday, both his younger siblings were sick. By the following Monday, the boy was dead. Scarlet fever. The words traveled through the valley like a cold wind, carrying fear before them. It was a disease that killed children the way winter killed livestock efficiently and without discrimination. There was no cure, only nursing, and nursing required knowledge that most frontier families did not possess. The Walsh family lost their 4-year-old daughter next. The Pattersons had 3 children down with fever simultaneously. And Doc Sutherland, the only physician within 100 miles, a man of 68, whose hands already trembled and whose own cough had worsened with each passing week, rode out to help and did not come back. They found him 2 days later, collapsed in the Morrison cabin, delirious with fever, too weak to stand. Obadiah responded to the crisis the way he responded to every threat. He sealed the ranch. No one leaves, no one enters. The boys do not go past the fence line. Every surface is cleaned with vinegar twice daily. Every visitor is turned away. His family would survive this because he would build a wall of discipline and caution around them so high that no disease could scale it. It might have worked. It might have been enough. But on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks into the outbreak, Mrs. Brennan rode up to the ranch on a horse lathered with sweat despite the freezing temperature, and she pounded on the front door with both fists until Obadiah opened it with a rifle in his hand. Doc is down, Mrs. Brennan said, her breath coming in clouds. He cannot stand, cannot think, cannot tell one end of a stethoscope from the other. There are 4 families with children sick and getting worse, and not a soul in this valley who knows what to do. Your wife told me her mother taught her basic medicine. I know she is not a doctor, but she is the closest thing we have. Jessamine stood in the kitchen doorway and felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders like a yoke. She looked at Mrs. Brennan, at the desperation in the older woman's face, at the snow melting on her shoulders from a ride that must have taken hours in the dark. Then she looked at Obadiah, and she saw the answer already forming in his expression before he spoke it. No, one word, complete and final and delivered with the absolute authority of a man defending the only perimeter that mattered to him. She is the mother of my children. She does not leave this ranch. There are children dying out there, Obadiah, Jessamine said. They are not my children. The sentence hung in the air between them, and Jessamine watched Obadiah hear his own words and recognize their cruelty without retracting them, because he meant them, because the fierce territorial love of a man who had already lost everything once would not allow him to risk losing again, not for neighbors, not for principle, not for anything. If Rosemary were alive, Jessamine said quietly, she would go. She saw the words land. She saw Obadiah's face go white, saw the muscles in his jaw tighten until the tendons stood out in his neck, saw the particular anguish of a man being confronted with an argument he could not defeat because it was true. Rosemary Drummond, the woman who brought soup to every sick neighbor and sat 3 days beside a laboring mother without sleeping, would never have stayed safe inside her house while children died in the valley below. Obadiah turned and walked into his study. The door closed with a sound that was worse than a slam because it was controlled, precise, the sound of a man putting a wall between himself and a truth he was not prepared to face. Lachlan found Jessamine in the kitchen already gathering supplies. I'm coming with you, he said. Obi will be angry, but he will understand, eventually. Phineas appeared in the doorway. He said nothing for a long moment, studying Jessamine with those calculating amber eyes. Then he spoke. If you are going, you need cloth masks, soaked in vinegar gloves, and water with which to wash your hands after touching every patient. Our mother used these methods when cholera came through this valley in 1852. She survived. So did we. Jessamine looked at Phineas and understood something she had not understood before. He was not objecting to her leaving. He was objecting to her leaving unprepared. This was Phineas Drummond's language of love. Not words, not gestures, survival. For 3 days, Jessamine and Lachlan traveled from cabin to cabin through the frozen valley. She used every piece of knowledge her mother had given her, knowledge she had stored away like seeds in a root cellar, unsure if they would ever be needed. Cool, wet claws on burning foreheads. Boiled water for everything. Isolation of the sick from the healthy. Broth and rest and constant vigilance. She was not a doctor, and she told every family as much. But she had an organized mind and steady hands, and the particular kind of courage that allowed her to walk into a room where death was present and refuse to be intimidated by it. Lachlan became her indispensable partner. He chopped wood and hauled water and kept fires burning in houses where parents were too weak to tend their own hearths. His cheerfulness, which Jessamine now understood was a form of armor, became genuine medicine for frightened children. He told stories and made faces and kept them laughing even when they were scared, and Jessamine realized that Lachlan's gift, the gift he had been using to hold his own family together since Rosemary's death, was equally powerful when deployed in the service of strangers. On the second day, Jessamine reached Doc Sutherland's cabin and found the old physician lying in his own bed, burning with fever, muttering through cracked lips. She cooled his forehead, forced water between his teeth, and listened carefully when his delirium became almost coherent. Medicine cabinet, he rasped. Third bottle, top shelf, quinine. She found the quinine, a precious supply that the doctor had been hoarding against exactly this kind of emergency. With his mumbled, semi-conscious guidance, she calculated dosages for the worst cases and rode through the snow to deliver them. The Walsh family's remaining daughter, 4 years old, had been feverish for 3 days without improvement. Her mother sat beside the bed with the empty eyes of a woman who had already begun grieving. Jessamine administered the quinine, changed the cold compresses, and sat through the night counting breaths, monitoring the rise and fall of a small chest that seemed too fragile to contain anything as fierce as a fight for life. Near dawn, the fever broke. the little girl opened her eyes and said, in a voice thin as paper, "I am thirsty." Her mother wept. Jessamine wept too, but she turned away so no one would see because she was supposed to be the strong one, the one who knew what to do, and strong people were not supposed to cry with relief over a stranger's child asking for water. On the third day, Jessamine changed every piece of clothing she was wearing before approaching the ranch. She scrubbed her hands and face with vinegar until her skin burned. She left her medical supplies outside the gate. She did everything she could think of to ensure she was not carrying the disease back to Bellamy and Thatcher. It was not enough. Phineas met her at the gate. His face was the color of old ash, and the expression on it told her what he was about to say before the words left his mouth. "Bellamy started fever last night." The world tilted. Jessamine grabbed the fence post and held on while the mountains spun around her and the sky came down to meet the ground. Not Bellamy, not the serious guarded boy who had just begun to trust her, who had sat on a dusty nursery floor and told her about his dead mother and his dead sister and the night his father's grief had broken through its dam. Not Bellamy, who had looked at her with those amber eyes and asked her to promise she would stay. She ran. Through the gate, across the yard, up the porch steps, through the front door, up the stairs, down the hallway to the room where Bellamy lay in his bed, with his face flushed and his breath coming in shallow gasps, and his father sitting beside him with both hands wrapped around one small hand, gray-faced stone, still looking exactly the way he must have looked on the night Rosemary died. "Ob," Jessamine said. "Move." He did not move. He sat there holding his son's hand with the immovable density of a man who believed that if he let go, the boy would drift away. "Obadiah Drummond, stand up and leave this room," Jessamine said, and the voice that came out of her was not the voice of a wife or a stepmother or a mail-order bride from Ohio. It was the voice of a woman who had walked 4 miles in a blizzard and nursed a valley through plague, and who absolutely was not going to lose this child. "Last time I trusted someone with my family," Obadiah said, and his voice was broken glass. "She died. I am not Rosemary, and Bellamy is not beyond saving. But I need you thinking clearly, not sitting here falling apart. So stand up. Go downstairs. Let me work." Something in her voice, perhaps it's certainty, perhaps it's fury, perhaps simply the fact that someone was telling him what to do and thereby relieving him of the unbearable weight of decision, reached Obadiah through his fog of terror. He stood. He looked at his son. He looked at Jessamine. And then he walked out of the room, and she heard his boots on the stairs, and then she heard through the floor the sound of a fist hitting the wooden wall of the porch. Once, twice, 3 times. Then nothing. Jessamine went to work. Quinine. Cold compresses every 30 minutes. Water small sips constantly. She sang badly songs her mother had sung to her when she was small and fevered, and frightened songs about rivers and meadows and safe harbors that existed nowhere in the real world, but everywhere in the geography of comfort. Thatcher appeared at midnight, clutching a stuffed bear that had seen better days. "Is Bellamy going to be okay?" "Bellamy is going to be fine," Jessamine said, and she put every ounce of conviction she possessed into the words, spending them like currency against an outcome she could not guarantee. Phineas sat outside Bellamy's door all night. He did not enter the room, did not speak, did not sleep. He simply sat with his back against the wall and his rifle across his knees, as if the disease were an intruder that could be shot if it dared to cross the threshold. It was irrational and impractical, and it was the most purely human thing Jessamine had ever seen any of the Drummond brothers do. Dawn came. The fever held. Morning passed. The fever held. By noon, Jessamine was running through the last of the quinine, and her own reserves of energy were reaching their bottom. She changed compresses with hands that trembled from exhaustion rather than fear, and she talked to Bellamy in a steady stream of consciousness that included everything from multiplication tables to the names of every state capital to a detailed description of how to tie a bull in knot. Because as long as she was talking, she was awake, And as long as she was awake, she was fighting. And as long as she was fighting, there was still a chance. At 4 in the afternoon on the second day, Bellamy's fever broke. It did not diminish gradually or taper off in stages. It broke the way ice breaks on a river in spring suddenly and completely. In one moment, the boy's skin was fire, and the next it was merely warm, and his breathing, which had been shallow and labored for 36 hours, deepened and steadied, and took on the rhythm of natural sleep rather than unconscious struggle. Bellamy opened his eyes. They were clear, exhausted, but present, the eyes of a boy returning from a place he should not have visited. "Mama Jess," he said, "I am here. I dreamed about Mama Rosemary. She told me you would keep me safe." Jessamine gathered the boy into her arms, and for the first time since she had arrived at the Drummond Ranch, Bellamy hugged her back. Not with the cautious tolerance he had shown before, not with the careful distance of a child protecting himself against future loss, but with the total, unreserved trust of a child who knows that the person holding him will never let go. Obadiah appeared in the doorway. His eyes were red and his face was haggard, and he had not slept in 2 days. He looked at his son in Jessamine's arms, and he did not say thank you, and he did not say I am sorry, and he did not say any of the things she knew were crowding behind his teeth. He just nodded. One nod, slow and heavy, carrying the weight of every word he could not speak. 1 week later, when Bellamy was sitting up in bed demanding real food instead of broth, Phineas returned from a hunting trip in the high country carrying something unexpected. Not game, not pelts, a child. She was 12 years old maybe, though so thin it was hard to tell. Her hair was matted and wild, her clothes were rags and her eyes dark brown, in a face white as birch bark, had the look of a feral animal watchful and ready to bolt. She was wrapped in Phineas's own deerskin coat, which engulfed her completely, and she trembled against his chest like something that had been cold for so long it had forgotten any other state of being. "Found her in a rock cave above the Corbin Ridge," Phineas said, and these were more consecutive words than Jessamine had heard from him in a month. "Mother ran off with a patent medicine peddler last fall. No father anyone knows of. She has been living wild in the mountains since the first snow." He set the girl down in the kitchen, and she immediately backed into a corner, pressing herself against the wall, with her knees drawn to her chest and her arms wrapped around them, making herself as small as possible. Her eyes moved from face to face, calculating distances and exits with the practiced efficiency of a creature that survived by knowing when to run. "She would not come out of the cave for 3 days," Phineas continued. "I left food at the entrance and sat 10 paces back and waited. Did not talk, did not move. Just sat until she decided I was not a threat. Her name is Nettie Plowman." Jessamine looked at the girl in the corner, at the tangled hair and the bitten fingernails and the eyes that trusted nothing and no one, and she saw herself. Not in appearance, not in circumstance, but in the fundamental thing that connected them across the distance between 23 and 12, between a carpet bag on a mountain trail and a rock cave above a frozen ridge. The fear, the absolute certainty that you belong nowhere and to no one. The bone-deep conviction that if you allowed yourself to be seen, to be known, to be needed, the world would find a way to take it all away. "She stays," Jessamine said. It was not a question. Obadiah looked at his wife. He looked at Phineas, who had brought this broken creature home the way he brought everything home without explanation or apology, simply presenting the fact of her and leaving others to respond. He looked back at Jessamine. He nodded. And the Drummond family, which had started as 3 brothers in a house built for isolation, which had grown to include 2 motherless boys and a desperate bride from Ohio, expanded once more to encompass a wild child from the mountains who had no one else in the world. The house was filling up, not with furniture or possessions, but with people, with need and fear and the fragile, stubborn, impossibly persistent human capacity to keep reaching for connection even after everything else had been stripped away. Outside, the winter howled on. But inside the Drummond house, something was growing that was stronger than weather and more durable than timber and stone. It was not love, not yet, but it was the soil in which love might take root if given enough time and enough courage and enough of the quiet daily acts of showing up that no one writes songs about, but that hold the world together nonetheless. Nettie Plowman did not speak for 11 days. She ate what was placed before her, slept in the small room off the kitchen that had been Jessamine's first quarters in the Drummond house, and watched the family with the unblinking vigilance of a wild creature confined to an unfamiliar den. She did not resist or rebel or make trouble of any kind. She simply existed in a state of absolute stillness, conserving energy the way animals do when they are uncertain whether the next moment will bring food or danger. Jessamine recognized the strategy because she had practiced a version of it herself during those first days after arriving at the ranch. The careful minimization of self that a person adopts when they have no power and no certainty and no guarantee that the ground beneath them will hold. She gave Nitwari the one thing that no one had apparently given the girl before: space. "This is your room," Jessamine told her on that first evening, standing in the doorway rather than entering, letting Nettie control the distance between them. "No one comes in unless, you say they can. That door has a latch, and it is yours to use." Nettie looked at the latch, then at Jessamine, then at the latch again. That night, Jessamine heard the soft click of metal sliding into place, and she stood in the hallway and felt something break and mend simultaneously inside her chest. It was Thatcher who cracked the silence. The boy possessed no understanding of boundaries and no instinct for caution, and an absolute conviction that everyone in the world was a potential friend who simply had not been properly introduced. On the second day of Nettie's residence in the Drummond house, Thatcher appeared at her door with an armload of carved wooden animals and a plan. He sat on the floor outside her room because the door was latched and began playing by himself, narrating an elaborate adventure involving a wooden bear, a wooden eagle, and a wooden horse, who were all lost in a snowstorm and trying to find their way home. His commentary was detailed and enthusiastic and directed at no one in particular, a 5-year-old's monologue delivered to the universe at large. On the second day of Thatcher's campaign, Nettie unlatched the door. She did not come out. She simply opened the door 3 inches and watched through the gap as the boy continued his game, apparently indifferent to whether he had an audience. On the third day, the door opened wider. On the 5th day, Nettie sat on the floor beside Thatcher, close enough to see the animals but not close enough to touch. On the 7th day, Thatcher handed her the wooden horse without comment, as if this were the most natural thing in the world, and Nettie took it and held it in both hands and ran her thumb across the smooth grain of the wood, and something in her face changed so subtly that you would have missed it if you were not watching for it: a softening around the eyes, a slight unclenching of the jaw, the first almost imperceptible relaxation of a body that had been braced for impact since the day its mother walked away. On the 11th day, she spoke. "What is the horse's name?" she asked so quietly that Thatcher had to lean in to hear her. "He does not have one yet," Thatcher said, unbothered by 11 days of silence, as if it were merely a long pause in a conversation that had been ongoing all along. "You should name him. You have been holding him for 4 days, so he is basically yours now." Nettie looked at the wooden horse. "Keeper," she said. "That is a good name." Thatcher agreed and returned to his game, and the matter was settled with the uncomplicated finality that only children can achieve. The relationship between Phineas and Nettie developed along lines that Jessamine had not predicted and could not have engineered. Phineas was the last person she would have expected to connect with a traumatized child. He was hard-edged and closed off and communicated primarily through action rather than language. He possessed none of Lachlan's warmth, none of Obadiah's quiet authority, and absolutely none of the gentle patience that conventional wisdom said was necessary for reaching a frightened girl. But Phineas had something else entirely. He had silence. He sat on the porch each evening, carving wood, a habit Jessamine had noticed from her first days at the ranch, but had never thought to question. He carved the way other men breathed, steadily and without apparent thought, his massive hands moving with a precision that seemed impossible given their size. He made animals, mostly horses and bears and eagles, working from blocks of pine and cedar, with a knife whose blade was worn concave from years of use. 3 days after Nettie's arrival, she appeared on the porch while Phineas was carving. She stood at the far end as distant as the porch would allow and watched him work with the intense focus of someone studying a skill they intended to learn. Phineas did not acknowledge her presence. He did not look up, did not speak, did not adjust his behavior in any way. He simply continued carving, and the sound of the blade on wood rhythmic and steady as a heartbeat filled the space between them. The next evening, Nettie stood slightly closer. By the end of the first week, she was sitting 3 feet away from him, still silent, watching the shape emerge from the block with an attention that was almost reverent. On the 8th evening, she spoke to him the same way she had spoken to Thatcher, so quietly that the words barely registered above the sound of the wind. "What are you making, Paul?" "A horse," Phineas said without looking up. "Who is it for?" "Not sure yet. Maybe someone who needs one." He did not say anything else, and neither did she, and they sat together in a silence that was not awkward or strained, but companionable. The silence of two people who understood that words were not always the most reliable bridge between one person and another. When Phineas finished the horse, he set it on the windowsill of Nettie's room without comment, without ceremony, without even confirming that she was in the room to receive it. Jessamine found out about it the following morning when she discovered Nettie asleep with the carved horse clutched against her chest. The way Bellamy clutched the horse Rosemary had made the way every child holds the thing that represents safety, pressing it close to the place where the heart is, because the heart knows what it needs even when the mind is forgotten. Something in Phineas shifted after that. He still spoke rarely and never about anything personal, but his orbit around the household tightened perceptibly. He began appearing at meals instead of eating alone. He sat in the front room during the evening reading hour instead of retreating to the barn. And Jessamine noticed that his eyes, which had watched her with suspicion during those early weeks, now watched her with something closer to recognition, as if she had passed a test he had not told her she was taking. The letter from Edmund Pratt arrived on a Tuesday in late March, carried by the mail rider who made the circuit through the valley once a fortnight when the roads were passable. Jessamine recognized the handwriting immediately, the careful, well-formed letters of a man who had been educated at good schools and had never worked a day with his hands. She stood at the kitchen table and read the letter twice, her face expressionless, while the bread dough she had been kneading waited on the floured board. Edmund had heard through some channel of gossip that apparently stretched from Colorado to Pennsylvania that Jessamine had married. He was not surprised, he wrote. A woman in her circumstances would naturally seek security wherever it could be found. He bore her no ill will for taking such a practical step. The reason for his letter, he explained, was that his family's fortunes had suffered a reversal. The cloth business was struggling. Certain investments had not performed as expected. He had been reflecting on his past decisions, and he had come to realize that releasing Jessamine from their understanding had been perhaps premature. He was prepared to forgive her hasty marriage if she would consent to obtain a divorce and return to Pennsylvania. He could offer her a comfortable life, he wrote, more befitting her education and refinement than whatever frontier existence she had settled for. He closed with a sentence that made Jessamine's hands curl into fists. "I understand that you did what you had to do in order to survive. I do not hold it against you." Jessamine set the letter on the table and stood looking at it for a long time. She expected to feel anger, and she did, but it was a distant, almost academic anger, the kind you feel when reading about an injustice that happened to someone else. The woman Edmund had discarded, the woman who had been so devastated by his rejection that she had questioned her own worth for months afterward, that woman felt very far away, now separated from the present by a distance that could not be measured in miles or months, but in transformations in the person she had been versus the person she had become. She brought the letter to Obadiah that evening. "You should see this," she said, placing it on his desk without explanation. He read it slowly, his face revealing nothing, which Jessamine had learned was not the same as feeling nothing. When he finished, he looked up at her, and she saw the question in his eyes before he asked it, and she understood that the question mattered to him far more than he would ever have admitted. Do you want to go back, Obey? Jessamine held his gaze without wavering. My home is here. My family is here. I'm not going anywhere. Obadiah nodded. He picked up the letter and held it over the lamp flame on his desk. The paper caught fire quickly, curling and blackening and releasing a thin trail of smoke that climbed toward the ceiling and disappeared. Jessamine watched it burn and noticed what Obadiah probably did not realize she had noticed. His hand trembled as he held the burning paper. Not from the heat, from fear. The fear of a man who had just discovered how much it would cost him to lose something he had not yet fully acknowledged he wanted to keep. Spring arrived in the valley with an almost theatrical suddenness, as if the mountains had decided overnight that winter had overstayed its welcome. The snow retreated up the slopes in stages, revealing meadows of green grass so vivid it seemed to vibrate. Streams that had been locked in ice for months broke free and ran clear and fast over stones that had not seen sunlight since November. The air, which had carried nothing but cold and wood smoke for so long that Jessamine had forgotten other smells existed, suddenly filled with the scent of pine sap and wildflowers and the rich, dark perfume of earth waking up. With the thaw came reckoning. The families Jessamine had nursed through the epidemic began appearing at the ranch. Not to ask for help this time, but to offer thanks, bringing food and supplies and the particular gift that frontier people valued above all others, the gift of showing up. Mrs. Morrison brought 3 jars of preserved peaches and stayed to help with laundry. Mr. Walsh repaired a section of fence that had been damaged by the winter storms. The Patterson family arrived with a wagon loaded with firewood, already split and stacked enough to last well into the following autumn. Doc Sutherland, recovered but diminished, rode up one afternoon to examine Bellamy's progress and pronounced the boy fully healed. He sat in the kitchen afterward drinking the coffee Jessamine made, which he declared the best in the territory, and said something that she carried with her for a long time afterward. Mrs. Drummond, I have been doctoring in this valley for 37 years. I have seen women who could run a household, and women who could nurse the sick, and women who could face down trouble without flinching. But I have never met one who could do all 3 at the same time while teaching 8 children to read. 7, Jessamine corrected. Nettie is still deciding whether she wants to learn. She will, Doc Sutherland said, with the certainty of a man who had watched the girl follow Phineas around the ranch like a shadow. That one is just making sure the ground is solid before she steps onto it. Cannot blame her for that. The Sunday following the thaw, Jessamine's classroom had its first session with the full roster. 7 children from neighboring ranches joined Bellamy, Thatcher, and Nettie in the upstairs room that Obadiah had cleared and outfitted with a blackboard he built himself from oak planks, sanded smooth, and painted with 3 coats of the blackest paint the general store in Elkhorn Creek could provide. Lachlan had built the desks, each one slightly different in height, because he measured each child before starting and sized the furniture to fit. Even Phineas contributed, appearing one morning with a shelf he had made and installed without being asked, perfectly positioned to hold the small library of books that Doc Sutherland had donated from his personal collection. The classroom was not fancy. The desks were rough-hewn, and the blackboard had a slight warp that made the chalk squeak at certain angles, and the stove in the corner required the same diplomatic negotiations as every other stove in the house. But it was a school, a real school in a home that had been built for isolation and was now, almost against the will of the man who built it, becoming the center of a community. Mrs. Hargrove came to church on the first Sunday after the thaw and placed a basket of eggs on the pew beside Jessamine without making eye contact. She did not speak, did not apologize, did not acknowledge in any way that she had once stood in the same churchyard, and implied that Jessamine was something less than respectable. She simply set the basket down and walked away. Jessamine looked at the eggs and understood. It was not an apology because Mrs. Hargrove was not a woman who apologized. It was an admission expressed in the only currency the woman could bear to spend. I was wrong. I know it. This is all I can give. Reverend Albright addressed the congregation that morning with words that carried the weight of official recognition. Mrs. Drummond has shown us that faith is not merely what we say in prayer, but what we do with our hands when our neighbors are in need. This community owes her a debt that cannot be repaid in Sunday sermons. Jessamine felt Obadiah's hand brush against hers on the pew, not taking her hand, not quite, but resting beside it, so that their fingers barely touched. And the contact so slight it might have been accidental if she had not felt him deliberately reach for it, sent warmth radiating up her arm and into her chest. The confession came on an evening in late April when the last of the snow had retreated to the highest peaks, and the valley below was green and gold in the long light of a spring sunset. Jessamine stood on the porch watching the mountains change color the way they did every evening, cycling through shades of pink and amber and purple that she had never seen in Ohio or Pennsylvania colors that seemed to exist only here at this altitude in this thin, clear air. She heard his boots on the porch boards before she heard his voice. Jess. The way Obadiah said her name was different than it had ever been before. Not clipped or professional or carefully neutral. Something had come loose in his voice, some restraint that had been holding the syllable at arm's length, and when he spoke her name now it arrived without armor, unprotected at the sound of a man who had decided to stop defending himself against something he could no longer pretend he did not feel. He stood beside her close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and he looked out at the mountains rather than at her, and he spoke slowly, choosing each word as if he were fitting stones into a wall that had to bear tremendous weight. When I put that advertisement in the newspaper, I thought I was solving a problem. I needed someone to manage the house and tend the boys and keep things running so I could work. That was all. I was not looking for anything else. I did not believe anything else was possible. That part of me died with Rosemary, or I thought it did, and I was content to leave it buried because buried things do not hurt. Jessamine stood very still, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. But you did something I did not expect. You did not try to be Rosemary. You did not try to fill the space she left. You did not even try to make me forget her. You just showed up every morning, every crisis, every argument, and every hard day, and every night when the wind was howling and the world felt like it was trying to shake this house apart. He turned to look at her, and what she saw in his face made her breath catch because it was not the expression of a man making a calculated decision or honoring a contractual obligation. It was the expression of a man standing at the edge of something vast and terrifying and choosing to step forward anyway. You taught Bellamy that loving someone new is not betrayal of someone lost. You gave Thatcher the mother's hands he has been reaching for since he was old enough to reach. You gave Nettie a home when the whole world turned its back on her. You rode out into a plague and nursed a valley of strangers because it was right, even though it might have cost you everything. His hand came up and touched her face, his callous thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands so large and so marked by labor. And you made me want to wake up in the morning. Not because there was work to do or cattle to tend or a ranch to run, because you were here. Because the first thing I would see was your face and the first thing I would hear was your voice. And the world made sense again in a way it has not made sense in 2 years. O.B. Jessamine whispered, I love you, Jess, not because I need you, although God knows I do, but because you are you, because I watched you face down a blizzard and ride out into a plague to save children who were not your own and hold my son through a fever that might have killed him. And never once, not one single time, did you back down from anything this life threw at you. And I want to stand beside you, not because of an arrangement, because I choose you. The tears came before Jessamine could stop them, hot and fast, and she did not try to hide them because there was nothing to hide from this man, not anymore. I love you, Obadiah Drummond, she said. I love this life and this house and these children and your impossible, stubborn, beautiful brothers. I love the way Bellamy guards his family like a soldier twice his age. I love the way Thatcher makes friends with everything that moves. I love the way Phineas says more with a carved wooden horse than most men say in a lifetime. I love the way Lachlan lights up every room he walks into, even when his own heart is breaking. And I love you, the man who gave me shelter and then without meaning to gave me everything. Obadiah kissed her, not the brief, formal, contractual kiss of their wedding day, the kiss that had been a seal on a bargain rather than an expression of feeling. This kiss was slow and warm and deliberate, the kiss of a man who had walked a very long way through very cold country and had finally at last come home. Jessamine's hands found his shoulders solid and real, and she felt the mountain strength of him, in the mountain tenderness, in the particular quality that she had come to understand was uniquely Obadiah, the capacity to be both the hardest and the gentlest thing in the room. The door of the bedroom closed softly that night, and when dawn broke over the Rocky Mountains, painting the snow on the high peaks in shades of rose and gold, everything between them had changed. Morning came with the smell of coffee and the sound of Thatcher's feet on the stairs, and the ordinary miracle of a family waking up in a house that was at last truly a home. Jessamine and Obadiah sat side by side at the breakfast table, their shoulders touching, and the small shift in their proximity did not go unnoticed. Bellamy looked at them across his plate of eggs and toast, and a smile spread across his face, slow and genuine, and entirely unguarded, the first smile Jessamine had seen from him that held nothing back. "Pa loves Mama Jess for real now, doesn't he?" he said. Not a question. "Yes," Obadiah said, and his voice was clear and steady and carried no hesitation at all. "For real. Mama Rosemary would be happy," Bellamy said, and the certainty in his voice, the generous, wise certainty of a child who understood that love was not a finite resource, that diminished when shared, that his mother's memory was not threatened by his father's new joy, that the heart had room and room and room, cracked something open in the kitchen that morning and let the light pour in. "She always wanted Pa to be happy," Bellamy continued. "She used to say that happiness was not something you kept in a jar. It was something and the more you gave, the more you had." Thatcher bounced in his chair with the unbridled enthusiasm of a child for whom all outcomes were either wonderful or not yet wonderful. "Does this mean Mama Jess stays forever and ever?" "Forever and ever," Jessamine promised. Nettie sat at the corner of the table in her customary position, the spot closest to the door, the escape route she maintained out of habit, even though the need for escape had diminished with each passing day. She ate her breakfast in small, careful bites, watching the exchange between the family members with the attentive stillness of someone cataloging evidence. When the conversation moved on to the day's plans, Nettie spoke. Her voice was still quiet, still tentative, still carrying the caution of a girl who had learned the hard way that words given to the wrong people could be used as weapons. But it was there, present and real, and what she said silenced the table. "Can I stay too?" Jessamine set down her coffee cup and moved around the table and knelt beside the girl's chair until their eyes were level, the same way she had knelt beside Thatcher on the night she arrived, the same instinctive lowering of position that said, "I am meeting you where you are, not asking you to reach up to me. This is your home, Nettie, for as long as you want it." Nettie nodded once quickly and returned to her eggs, and the matter was settled. But Jessamine saw the girl's hand move under the table and find the carved horse in her pocket and hold it there, pressing the smooth wood against her palm, and she knew that Nettie Plowman had just made a decision that was harder and braver than anything the girl had ever done in the mountains alone. She had decided to trust. Phineas came through the kitchen door carrying a pail of milk from the morning's milking. He set it on the counter and poured himself coffee, black, no sugar, the same way Jessamine had been making it for him since that first morning when he had given her the instructions that were not instructions but an opening a crack in the door he had held so tightly shut. He stood by the counter and surveyed the table, the family around it, the warmth in the room that came from something far more enduring than the kitchen stove. His gaze lingered on Nettie for a moment, and Jessamine saw something move across his features, too quick to name, but unmistakable. Something that looked like the first green shoot pushing through the surface of soil that had been frozen for a very long time. He walked past Jessamine on his way to the door, and as he passed, he placed his hand on her shoulder. It lasted 1 second, perhaps less. A brief pressure of his palm against the fabric of her dress, the weight of a hand that could bend iron and gentle horse and carve wood into shapes so precise they seemed to breathe. Then it was gone, and Phineas was gone out the door and into the morning without a word. But Jessamine stood in the kitchen and felt the ghost of that touch on her shoulder and understood that Phineas Drummond had just said in the only language he possessed, the thing he had been unable to say since the day she arrived. "You belong here. This is your family. I am glad you came." Lachlan appeared last, as he often did, making an entrance that turned the simple act of walking into a kitchen into a minor theatrical event. He saw Obadiah and Jessamine, noted their proximity, registered the change in the air, and his face split into a grin so wide it seemed to illuminate the room. He picked Jessamine up off the ground in a bear hug that lifted her feet clear of the floor, despite her protests, spinning her once before setting her down with the careful strength of a man who knew exactly how much force to apply and how much to hold back. Finally, he announced to no one in particular and everyone in general, "I told Finn 6 weeks ago that Obey would come around before the snow melted. He owes me $5. I did not make that bet." Phineas's voice came from outside the kitchen window, where he was apparently still within earshot. "Then what was the $5 you gave me last Tuesday?" No answer came from outside, but Jessamine could have sworn she heard something that might have been a low chuckle, though she would never have been able to prove it. 6 months to the day after the contract wedding in the front parlor, Obadiah Drummond did something that no one in the valley had expected, and that he himself would have considered inconceivable on the day he placed that newspaper advertisement in search of a practical wife. He planned a wedding. Jessamine was standing at the kitchen window kneading bread when she heard the wagons. Not one wagon, which might have been a neighbor. Not two, which might have been a delivery. A convoy winding up the mountain road with the slow deliberation of a procession, carrying what appeared from this distance to be a significant portion of the population of Elkhorn Creek and the surrounding valley. She wiped the flour from her hands and walked to the porch, and found Obadiah standing there dressed in his best suit, the same dark wool he had worn for their first wedding. But everything about him was different. Where he had been stiff and formal before, he was now relaxed and smiling. Where his eyes had been guarded and careful, they were now warm with the certainty of a man who was not making a practical arrangement, but honoring a truth that had been growing between them since the night a stranger walked out of a blizzard and into his life. "Obadiah Drummond," Jessamine said slowly, watching the wagons approach. "What have you done?" "I have been thinking," he said, and the sheepishness in his voice was so uncharacteristic that it almost made her laugh. "About something you never said, but I heard anyway. Our first wedding was a contract. It served its purpose, and I do not regret it. But it was not what you deserved. It was not what we deserved." The wagons had reached the ranch now, and Jessamine could see faces she recognized. Mrs. Brennan in the lead, her expression carrying the satisfied look of a woman who had been entrusted with a logistical challenge and had met it with military precision. The Morrison family with baskets of food. The Walshes carrying armfuls of wildflowers, early spring blossoms gathered from the meadows below the snow line. Doc Sterling in his buggy wearing a collar and tie for what was probably the first time in a decade. Even Mrs. Hargrove sitting stiff and correct beside her husband, but present, which was itself a concession that would have been unthinkable 3 months ago. "Surprise, Mama!" Thatcher erupted from behind the porch rail where he had apparently been hiding, with the patience of a boy who had been promised something wonderful if he could remain silent for 5 minutes. "Pa is giving you a real wedding. I helped pick the flowers, and Bellamy is carrying the ring, and Nettie helped Uncle Finn make a special surprise, but I am not supposed to tell you what it is." Bellamy appeared beside his brother, his serious face bright with the pleasure of a secret successfully kept. "We have been planning for 2 weeks," he said with quiet pride. "Pa made us promise not to tell. It was very hard. Thatch almost broke 4 times. 3 times, Thatcher protested. The time in the barn does not count because nobody heard me." Jessamine felt her throat tighten as the guests began to gather in the front yard, arranging themselves around a space beneath the old maple tree, where someone had constructed an archway from bent willow branches and woven through it the first wildflowers of spring. It was not the polished elegance of a church wedding. It was rough and handmade and imperfect, assembled by calloused hands that were better suited to fence posts than flower arrangements, and it was the most beautiful thing Jessamine had ever seen. Mrs. Brennan appeared at her elbow. "Come along, dear. You cannot get married in a flower-covered apron." They led her inside, and 20 minutes later, Jessamine emerged wearing her navy wool dress, pressed and brushed, with a collar of delicate lace that Mrs. Patterson had contributed, a piece so fine that it must have been an heirloom. Her hair was brushed until it shone and pinned with a sprig of mountain laurel that Mrs. Brennan had somehow procured despite the early season. She was not wearing white, and there were no satin gloves and no train trailing behind her. But when she stepped onto the porch and Obadiah saw her, the expression on his face told her that she could have been wearing a flour sack, and it would not have mattered. Reverend Albright stood beneath the willow archway with his Bible open, and for the first time in Jessamine's experience, a genuine smile on his weathered face. "Well then," he said, "let us do this properly." The vows were nothing like the first time. Obadiah took Jessamine's hands in his and spoke with a voice that carried across the yard with the quiet conviction of a man who meant every syllable the way he meant the nails he drove and the fences he built permanently. "Jess, 6 months ago I offered you a contract, a practical arrangement between two people who each needed something the other could provide. I told you I was not looking for love. I told you I could not promise anything more than shelter and security and my name. I was wrong about all of it." He paused, and Jessamine saw the emotion move through him like weather across a mountain, visible and powerful and impossible to hide. "You brought light back into a house I had let go dark. You brought wisdom to my children and courage to my brothers, and you brought something to me that I was too stubborn and too scared to name until I almost lost it. You are not the woman I was looking for, Jessamine Drummond. You are the woman I did not know I needed. And I promise to honor you and stand beside you and choose you every single day for as long as this heart beats and these hands can hold yours." Jessamine's vows were simpler because she had always believed that the truest things were the plainest. "Obi, you gave me shelter when I had nowhere to go. But more than that, you gave me a family. Not just you and the boys, but Phineas and Lachlan and Nettie. A family built not from blood, but from choosing. From showing up every morning and doing the work and refusing to quit even when it would have been easier to walk away. I promise to be your partner in every season, winter and summer, storm and calm. I promise to love your children as my own and to help you build something that will outlast both of us." Bellamy carried the ring with the gravity of a boy entrusted with sacred duty. Thatcher scattered flower petals with more enthusiasm than accuracy, covering a radius that extended well beyond the ceremonial area and into the crowd of guests, several of whom received petals in their hair, and one of whom, Doc Sutherland, received a handful directly in his open mouth. Nettie stood beside Phineas in a dress that Mrs. Brennan had sewn for the occasion, the first new garment the girl had worn in longer than anyone wanted to calculate. Her hand rested on the edge of Phineas's vest, not holding exactly, but touching, maintaining contact. And Phineas stood with his arms at his sides and let her hold on, in the image of this massive, silent man and this small, silent girl standing together in the spring sunlight was a story in itself, a story about the unexpected shapes that family can take when you stop insisting it look a certain way and let it become what it needs to be. When Reverend Albright pronounced them husband and wife for the second time, Obadiah's kiss was everything the first one had not been. It was confident and tender and unashamed, the kiss of a man who had walked through grief and guilt and the particular loneliness of being strong all the time and had found on the other side a woman who was strong enough to match him. The celebration lasted until the sun went down and the lanterns that someone had strung between the trees began to glow against the darkening sky. There was music, Mrs. Morrison on the fiddle, and Lachlan on a harmonica he played with surprising skill, and dancing on the grass, and food enough to feed twice the number of guests and children running wild between the adults with the limitless energy that children generate, at celebrations as if joy were a fuel that the young could burn without ever running out. Jessamine danced with Obadiah and then with Thatcher, who stood on her feet and let her carry him through a waltz that he would remember for the rest of his life. She danced with Lachlan, who spun her until she was dizzy and breathless, and laughing in a way she had not laughed since she was a girl on her father's farm in Ohio before death and debt, and Edmund Pratt's cold letter had taught her that the world was harder than she had imagined. She did not dance with Phineas because Phineas did not dance. But at one point during the evening, she looked across the crowd and found him watching her, and he raised his tin cup of cider in a gesture so slight that no one else would have noticed it. A private toast from a man who did not make public displays, but who wanted her to know in his own silent way that he approved of what had been built here today. Mrs. Hargrove approached Jessamine late in the evening when most of the guests were preparing to leave and the lanterns were burning low. The older woman stood in front of Jessamine for a long moment without speaking, her face working through an expression that looked like it was causing her physical discomfort. "Mrs. Drummond," she said finally, "my granddaughter is alive because of you. I have not said that before now, and I should have. I have said other things that I should not have, and I cannot unsay them. But I can say this. You are a credit to this community, and Rosemary Drummond would be proud of what you have done for her family." She turned and walked away before Jessamine could respond, her back straight and her chin high, and Jessamine watched her go and thought that sometimes the hardest thing in the world was not facing a blizzard or a fever or three suspicious mountain men, but admitting that you had been wrong about someone and that the person you had judged was better than you had allowed yourself to see. The guests departed as the stars came out, their wagons and horses creating a slow procession down the mountain road, lanterns bobbing in the darkness like a river of light flowing back toward the valley. The children were put to bed, Thatcher still talking about the best party ever, as his eyes closed, Bellamy settling into his pillow with the quiet satisfaction of a boy who had helped create something important, Nettie in her room with the carved horse on the pillow beside her, and the door for the first time left unlatched through the night. Obadiah and Jessamine sat on the porch in the darkness, the sounds of the empty celebration field settling into silence around them. Lachlan played his harmonica on the lower step, a slow melody that had no name but seemed to contain within its simple notes everything the evening had meant, the journey from contract to love, from strangers to family, from survival to something that might, with enough care and enough courage, last forever. Phineas sat in his usual corner, carving by moonlight. Jessamine watched his hands move and saw what he was making, and felt her eyes fill with tears for perhaps the 10th time that day. It was a cradle, small and perfect, the wood smooth under his knife, each joint fitted with the meticulous precision that characterized everything Phineas did. He was building the cradle that Rosemary had started and never finished, but he was not building it for the baby who had been lost. He was building it for the future. Obadiah's hand rested on Jessamine's waist, and the protective tenderness of the gesture told her what she had suspected for several weeks but had not yet confirmed. She placed her own hand over his, and he understood, and neither of them spoke about it because some things were too new and too precious for words, and the night was too beautiful for anything but silence and gratitude. "Do you ever regret it?" Obadiah asked. "The road that brought you here." Jessamine thought about the farm in Ohio and her parents' graves and Edmund's letter, and the schoolhouse that closed, and the boarding house she could not afford, and the newspaper advertisement she had answered in desperation, and the 4 miles of blizzard, and the 3 men in the doorway, and the woman who would not smile, and the girl in the cave, and the valley full of fever, and the night she sat sleepless beside a burning child, willing him to live. "Not 1 second," she said. "Every hard step led me here. Now I know," Obadiah said, pulling her closer against the chill of the mountain night, "that sometimes the best thing in a man's life is not the thing he went looking for. It is the thing that walked 4 miles through a blizzard and knocked on his door." Jessamine laughed softly, and the sound carried out across the valley in the still night air, and disappeared into the darkness between the mountains. On the step below Lachlan, harmonica shifted to something that sounded almost like a lullaby. In the corner, Phineas's knife moved steadily, shaping wood into a vessel for the future. And upstairs, behind closed doors, three children slept, two who carried the drum in blood, and one who had been chosen, and all three were safe and warm and loved, in a house that had been built for shelter, but had become against all expectation and against the explicit intentions of the men who built it a home. They had started with a contract, a newspaper advertisement, and a two-paragraph letter, and a handshake over coffee so black it could have stripped paint. Two people who needed what the other could provide, nothing more, nothing less, the most practical of all possible arrangements. But they had built something that no contract could contain. A family forged not from blood or obligation, but from the daily, deliberate, sometimes agonizing choice to stay, to show up, to keep trying, to hold on when the wind was howling and the fever was burning and the world was doing its level best to tear apart every fragile thing you had managed to piece together. Jessamine Drummond, who had arrived at this ranch with a carpet bag and $3 silver and nothing else in the world, leaned against her husband's shoulder and listened to the mountain wind and knew with a certainty that went deeper than logic or calculation that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because fate had put her here, not because desperation had driven her here, but because she had chosen to stay, and in choosing had discovered that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin not with passion, but with practicality, not with romance, but with necessity, and become extraordinary, not because of how they start, but because of what the people inside them are willing to build one day at a time, one act of faith at a time, one quiet morning of coffee and bread and children's laughter at a time. Outside, the Rocky Mountains stood in the moonlight, ancient and indifferent and magnificent, and the wind that had tried to kill her 6 months ago now carried the scent of spring and the promise of everything that was yet to come.